Welcome to the Global African Diaspora Lecture Series. On behalf of the African University of Communications and Business, we are delighted to welcome you to this platform, which is dedicated to insightful discussions on the experiences, contributions, and impact of continental Africa and the African diaspora. This series brings together scholars, thought leaders, and changemakers to explore the rich tapestry of African and African diasporic history, culture, and innovation. We look forward to engaging conversations that inspire new perspectives and meaningful connections. Thank you for joining us. The Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies is committed to becoming a leading center for Pan-African scholarship and collaboration, bringing together scholars and thinkers from the African world to conduct research and deliberate on issues affecting the welfare and destiny of African peoples, and to disseminate their findings as widely as possible. Additionally, the center will be an incubator for innovative research to generate new knowledge that advances professional practice for those at the cutting edge of transformative development. The center contributes significantly to the university's mission of, quote, preparing lifelong learners to become innovative problem solvers and ethical leaders in the fields of communication, business, and related areas through excellence in interdisciplinary teaching, research, and collaboration at the local, regional, and global levels using a Pan-African framework, unquote, as well as to the university's core value of embracing African cultural values. The university is not merely a university in Africa with an African label. It is an African university with an ethos and the explicit intent to produce graduates who fully understand, appreciate, and unapologetically manifest their Africanness in all spheres of their lives. The need to provide an education at the tertiary level that enhances the self-awareness of students as Africans led to the establishment in 2009 of the Center for Africana Studies at this university. The Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies was officially launched under its current name on the 22nd of June of 2015 as an interdisciplinary institution dedicated to the creation and advancement of knowledge about the peoples and cultures of Africa and the African diaspora through scholarly research, teaching, and publication aimed at the regeneration of African peoples and societies. I now have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Noble is a graduate of the University of Ghana and the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is currently studying for his Ph.D. in history at the University of Manchester. His research areas of interest are intellectual history and history of science, with a specific regional focus on Africa. In 2021, he worked as an associate producer for Talking Black in America, Roots, which is a documentary about language that explored the African roots of African American English. This film is available on PBS and YouTube, and it received a Southeast Emmy nomination for the category of Best Historical Documentary. Noble is the founder of SENET 17, a Ghanaian company that develops educational and fun games based on African ideas and concepts. He is also the founding editor of The Gourd, a Ghanaian literary and cultural magazine. He loves listening to reggae music, jazz, and African drumming, especially by the Ewe people of Ghana and Togo. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you very much.
Other people, non-Africans elsewhere, living in other parts of the world have equally achieved great and remarkable things. However, social evolution and progress on the African continent received a violent shock when with the coming of the transatlantic slave trade and during the period of colonial domination. The Ghanaian poet Kwejo Opoku Ajiman noted in the introduction to his book, Cape Coast Castle, a collection of poems, that the history of Africa in the 4 centuries of European slave trading is a history of warfare and destruction. The darkness of the dark continent was born here in that fretful culture of dense fear. One by one, the light of learning and life was dimmed, then was turned off. Thus began an eclipse whose effect we are still living. He continued, "It is not remarked too often, but it is not for nothing that the collapse of the last of the great African civilizations coincided with the coming of the slave trade. From here on, for long centuries, scientific knowledge hid its head in the folds of magic, and it died there for the lack of air. From the fear to openly observe and testify the fact and the glory of life." After the transatlantic slave trade was abolished, African societies entered the phase of colonization. Under the yoke of colonialism, the total and complete flowering of Africans in all aspects, political, social, economic, cultural, was deliberately and calculatedly obstructed by the European governments who invaded and carved up the continent and ruled with force and violence everywhere. One by one, the European armies overcame the resistance of Africans, and eventually victorious, they set up a system of administration here whose primary aim was organized armed robbery and legitimized violence. Colonialism, Frantz Fanon said, is violence in its natural state. It should be made clear that colonialism was an encounter marked by violence, Fanon said, and its existence, that is to say, the exploitation of the native by the settlers, was carried by dint of a great array of bayonets and cannon. Colonialism enabled a system of exploitation in the form of the extraction of raw materials from the continent, and it was supported by a system of racism that denigrated African traditions and practices. Kwame Nkrumah began his address to the audience by highlighting how intellectual work on African communities had been impacted by the colonial era. He said, and I quote, "First and foremost, I would emphasize the need for a reinterpretation and a new assessment of the factors which make up our past. We have to recognize frankly that African studies, in the form in which they have developed in the universities and centers of learning in the West, have been largely influenced by the concepts of old-style colonial studies, and still to some extent remain under the shadow of colonial ideologies and mentality." What was that old style of colonial studies Nkrumah was referring to? Under the superficial scrutiny of the European eyes and mind, which was often blinded and clouded by prejudice, ignorance, and racism, African ideas, concepts, and practices were caricatured and distorted. And when compared to European ideas and practices, African ideas and practices were thought to be underdeveloped or inferior. We know that most of the conclusions that European scholars arrived at about African ideas and practices were very far from the truth. A line from Bob Marley's song, "Stiff-Necked Fools," captures this attitude perfectly. Bob Marley said, "Yes, yes, you have got the wrong interpretation mixed up with vain, vain imagination." The wrong interpretation mixed up with vain imagination. Peter K. Sapon, the anthropologist and theologian, in his autobiography, From the Heart to Oxford, referring to the work of European missionaries, expressed that he is often saddened by the fact that missionaries did not make a conscious effort to understand the complexities of traditional African beliefs and practices. And why should they? They came here with a different agenda, a preconceived notion about Africans and our ways. Here are two verses from hymn number 801 of the famous Methodist hymn book, titled From Greenland to Icy Mountains, written in 1911 by Reginald Heber, who is best known for his very popular hymn, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. But in this other hymn, he expresses something different. And let me quote. The hymn begins, verse 1, "From India's coral stand, where Africa's sunny fountains roll down their golden sand, from many an ancient river, from many a palmy plain, they call us to deliver their land from error's chain. Can we, whose souls are lighted with wisdom from on high, can we to men benighted the lamp of life deny? Salvation, O salvation, the joyful sound proclaim, to reach remotest nation has learned, till each remotest nation has learned Messiah's name." So you can clearly see they were coming here to do what? To free us from error's chain, because they are the ones with the lighted souls, and ours is the benighted soul. Well, inspired by this racist hymn and with this religious frame of mind, how could they have appreciated what we had developed in Africa? Europeans were concerned about African thoughts and practices and studied them only to the extent that it served to further their imperialist agenda. Nkrumah put it in the address this way: "Until recently, the study of African studies was regarded as a minor and marginal theme within the framework of imperial history. The study of African social institutions and cultures was subordinated in varying degrees to the effort to maintain the apparatus of colonial power. In British institutes of higher learning, for example, there was a tendency to look to social anthropologists to provide a kind of knowledge that will help to support the particular brand of colonial policy," end of quote. Thus, after independence in 1957, a new attitude of mind and approach was required. And this was what Nkrumah described in the African Genius Address. And I quote, "One essential function of this institute must surely be," Nkrumah said, "to study the history, culture, and institutions, languages and arts of Ghana and of Africa in new African-centered ways, in entire freedom from propositions and presuppositions of the colonial epoch, and from the distortions of those professors and lecturers who continue to make European studies of Africa the basis of this new assessment. By the work of this institute, we must reassess and assert the glories and achievements of our African past and inspire our generation and succeeding generations with a vision of a better future. But you should not stop there. Your work must also include a study of the regions and culture of peoples of African descent in the Americas and the Caribbean, and you should seek to maintain close relations with their scholars so that there may be cross-fertilization between Africa and those who have their roots in the African past," end of quote. Studying the African past is studying the African genius, which are the concepts and ideas we developed here to help us survive, thrive, and flourish as a people. And by the African genius, this is what Nkrumah meant precisely. And I quote, "When I speak of the African genius, I mean something dynamic. By the African genius, I mean something positive. Our socialist conception of society, the efficiency and validity of our traditional statecraft, our highly developed code of morals, our hospitality, and our purposeful energy." The African genius, end of quote. The African genius is not static. It is dynamic. It evolves. And this is why we can talk about the characteristics of the African genius today. But what are we to do with this African genius? We must study and know it, of course. But even more importantly, we must add to it in creative ways. For example, a few examples here will suffice. I mentioned that Nkrumah highlighted the work of Professor J.H. Nketia in his address. Professor Nketia's work and materials are stored at the J.H. Nketia Archives at the University of Ghana, and you should visit when you get the chance. His work revolved around African music. He rescued African music and oral traditions from colonial misinterpretations. And here's what Nkrumah said precisely about Professor Nketia that day. I quote, "I also regard as important the work which you are doing in the collection of stool histories and other forms of oral tradition, of poetry and African literature in all its forms, of which one admirable expression is Professor Nketia's recently published book entitled Folk Songs of Ghana," end of quote. By doing the kind of work Professor Nketia and others started, we will be working towards creating what Nkrumah described in his address as the Library of African Classics. Wouldn't that be beautiful? Inside this library, the African student can find inspiration for creative work to last for a lifetime. Adding creatively to the African genius is the task we must set for ourselves today. Nkrumah again gave an example of what this work could look like in the field of literature. And I quote, "In studying the arts, however, you must not be content with the accumulation of knowledge about the arts. Your research must stimulate creative activity. It must contribute to the development of the arts in Ghana and other parts of Africa. Research must stimulate the birth of a specifically African literature, which, exploring the themes and depths of the African soul, will become an integral portion of a general world literature," end of quote. I'm assuming there are some writers in the audience here. This is a task we must embrace, since I am a writer as well. Is this too ambitious an aim? Nkrumah did not think so, and I do not think so either. It was an invitation to the generation he was talking to that day, and an invitation to us today to continue the work of developing the African genius here in Ghana and in Africa. Before I bring this talk to a close, here is an aspect of the African genius I would like to highlight, and this is African proverbs. There are others, like the Adinkra symbols and African myths. Specifically on African myths, I don't know if you've encountered the work of Marlon James, the Jamaican writer. He has a trilogy that is specifically based on African mythology, and which is being called the African Game of Thrones. But he has two of the titles in that trilogy is currently out. One of it is Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and the other one is Moon Witch, Spider King. It's amazing work. And all of this writing comes out of African mythology. But I want to focus on African proverbs today. I love African proverbs. And as Chinua Achebe put it very well, in Africa, proverbs are the palm oil with which we eat words, or which I like to twist by saying, proverbs are the palm wine with which we drink words. The late Reverend N.K. Jobo has done a great work in collecting and compiling more than 1,200 ever proverbs. And Peggy Appiah, Kwame Anthony Appiah, and Ivor Ajimandia have also compiled more than 7,000 Akan proverbs. These Ghanaian scholars have done a great job in fulfilling part of the work Nkrumah assigned to us in his address. These proverbs contain eternal wisdom, advice, and instructions for living based on observations and creative imagination of our ancestors. Proverbs, Reverend Jobo explained, are derived from a careful observation of both natural and social events and from the lives of people, of both wild and domestic animals, end of quote. Proverbs are a well-developed African system of thought. Basing our education on African systems of thought is critical. And as the Ghanaian historian Francis Abudika pointed out, and I quote, the importance of this is to be seen in the fact that the traditions of a people hold the genius of that race. To deprive a people of the wisdom of its past is to destroy its soul. We need to base education on wisdom of the African past to be able to contribute a quota that is Africa's to contribute towards world civilization, end of quote. Our proverbs constitute an important system of thought that sheds light on our African philosophical, scientific, and religious ideas and concepts. Reverend Jobo again said, at the roof of every language and culture are proverbs whose proper understanding leads one to the soul of the Ewe, to their philosophy and to their principles that serve partly to integrate the personality of the individual. More than that, an understanding of them reveals some of the fundamental determinants of moral behavior. Even though the emphasis in this study is on the moral determinants of behavior, yet the reader will gain some insight into the philosophy and collective character of the Ewe, end of quote. So, as an Ewe, I sincerely value the work that Reverend Jobo has done, and I consult it regularly for creative and philosophical inspiration in my own creative work. Finally, let me highlight the use of African proverbs in the teaching of science, which is my area of research here at Manchester, which is the history of science. This was beautifully done by the Ghanaian material scientist Kojo Osuasare. And please permit me to quote him extensively. So he visited Ghana to teach for a while at the University of Ghana School of Engineering. And here's what he had to say. I spent the second, and I quote, I spent the second semester of 2007-2008 academic year as a visiting professor of material science and engineering in the new School of Engineering Sciences at the University of Ghana. Following conversations with the then dean, I had assumed that I would most likely be teaching the course Introduction to Ceramics. This is not a course I teach in my home university, but I was willing to consider it since I thought it could provide me with an opportunity to develop some new approaches to the treatment of the relevant topic. A few days before classes started, I found out by accident from a colleague that I had been assigned a different course. Noticing my surprise, the colleague walked me to the bulletin board where it was clearly posted that my assigned course was MSEN 325, Materials and the Future. I have since learned that it is not unusual practice in many African universities. Instructors are assigned courses sometimes as late as the first week of classes. Fortunately, I remembered the book I had noticed in the university bookstore during the first week we arrived on campus. Bumebe, Proverbs of the Accounts. And this is the book I was referring to, compiled by Peggy Opon and Kwame Antonio Pia. It occurred to me that African proverbs might provide an opportunity to link technological advances to the local Ghanaian African environment, thereby encouraging engineering students in Africa to go beyond textbook engineering. When I entered the classroom for our first meeting, students were seated facing the chalkboard. I instructed them to organize the chairs into a circle. These were third-year engineering students, and they were not used to this kind of seating arrangement. Naturally, they were a bit puzzled. Then I handed them the first assignment. And this is the assignment. Provide 6 Ghanaian proverbs with a materials connection. For each proverb, give the rendition in the relevant Ghanaian language, indicate the language, provide an appropriate English translation, explain the meaning, discuss the materials connection, and then provide a report of 750 to 1,000 words plus oral presentation. First, in class practice, students were asked to provide some proverbs with material connection. At first, nobody volunteered anything. They protested. I do not know any proverbs. I do not know how to write in my mother tongue. Well, I provided an example. Dadiebi tra dadiebi, iron sharpens iron, and asked them to discuss the material implication. The first suggestion from the student was that this proverb points the superiority of one material over another, in this case, concerning mechanical properties. On further discussion, another student offered that the proverb illustrates the need for collaboration. If a knife wants to be sharper, it needs the help of another material. To the student who claimed that they knew no African proverbs, I challenged them to reflect on the fact that they are engineers. They are being trained at the university to solve problems. How can they solve their problem of proverbial ignorance? The suggestion that came out of our ensuing discussion included the following. They can ask parents and friends, and they can check if the library has books on proverbs. In the next class meeting the following week, the students provided some feedback on the assignment. Their comments included such statements as, "My parents were surprised. They thought the assignment was strange." They asked, "Is this really an engineering course? It sounds more like a course in African studies." Well, Nkrumah touched on this artificial demarcation of academic disciplines when he stressed the fact that African studies at Legon must fertilize the entire university. Professor Osiasari's student came back for the second lecture armed with proverbs that mention materials like salt, which is sodium chloride, gunpowder, vine, which is cellulose biomaterials, which contains cellulose biomaterials, and gunpowder is nitrocellulose formulations. So clearly, our ancestors may not have had the instrument to scrutinize these substances in the laboratory, but this is our task. The further empirical scientific investigations into these substances and their properties is our job to do today, using modern tools that our ancestors lacked. And I'll end with this quote by Professor Kojo Osiasari. And I quote, "Here we see the students could not imagine that a proverb could serve as a pedagogical tool in engineering. Yet, as Chino Achebe noted, in Igbo African culture, proverbs are the palm wine with which we eat words. Thus, it cannot be assumed that the engineers of traditional societies would have found proverbial language to be incompatible with engineering imagination and practice. Still, a relevant question remains. Do proverbs have a utility beyond the world of ancestral engineers? I thank you for your time.
So, Mr. Nazzah, we thank you very much for your insightful presentation today. And I think that it presents us with an excellent foundation to engage in a conversation about the significance of the African genius today. I'll first ask students who are present if they have any questions. I have a series of questions myself, but I'd like to give them an opportunity to engage you first. Sometimes they need a little encouragement, but we'll see how today goes. Is there anyone who has a comment or question about what Mr. Nazzah has shared with us today about the African genius today, which we know was inspired by a speech that Kwame Nkrumah gave at the opening of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana in Legon, as a part of a nation building project as well as Pan-Africanism. Any questions, comments? Well, I should start. Okay, so I'll start. I really am happy that you started with an emphasis on the need to read pivotal Ghanaian scholars such as Kwame Nkrumah, so as well as Nkrumah and others. So my first question is, how would you encourage this generation of tertiary students as well as students from primary to secondary education. How would you encourage this generation of young people to read scholars like Kwabena Nketia and Kwame Nkrumah, since we know that they are not, and it's not a part of their educational experience inside and outside of the classroom? How would you go about encouraging them to engage such scholars?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think there are two things are at play here. First of all, there is a general lack of access to some of these books and materials. Um, in that, when you visit your traditional bookstore in Ghana, I mean, you would find most of the shelves populated by these second-rate European novels and books. Because also because they have the here in Europe and in America, they have the infrastructure, I mean, to produce books in excess, and the excess get distributed or floods other markets. So you'll be really hard pressed, or it'll be very difficult to find books written by some of our African or Ghanaian scholars in Ghana. So there is that problem of access to begin with. But a few publishing companies are beginning to enter the field and are beginning to make a difference. So the structural problem of making these books available is one key thing that we have to also tackle as a country. And beyond that, I believe that it is also the duty of teachers and lecturers and professors to consciously highlight these texts and these books. And because sometimes the students may not know these books exist until they are highlighted or brought to their attention. So I think it's two pronged. So our publishing industry needs the support to pick up, and also professors and teachers must make a conscious effort to highlight some of these books and bring those books to the knowledge of students. And if that is done in very inspiring and creative ways, I'm sure that students would naturally gravitate towards these texts and these scholars. Personally, I think one of the scholars that really inspired me in this direction is Professor Kofi Nazzah. Every time I read his work or I listen to any of his lectures, you can see that he highlights a lot of Ghanaian and African scholars in his lectures and in his write-up. And that for me has been one of the ways in which I've come up to speed with African scholars. So yeah, that's what I would have to say.
Thank you very much. Question, comment. You don't want me to ask all the questions today, or do you? I should ask the second one. Yes. Okay, you are still warming up. Okay, so Mr. Nazzah, you talked, I think, insightfully about the establishment of the Institute of African Studies at Legon and the legacy of Nkrumah's vision of African studies being compulsory in public institutions of higher education. Could you talk about that legacy today? This center, as well as other programs of Africana studies or African studies in Ghana, is a part of that legacy. So I just wanted you to share with our very young audience some of this, some of your thoughts, additional thoughts about the significance of African studies or Africana studies being compulsory for all university students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we can't emphasize it enough that we need to really begin to highlight, like Nkrumah said, the achievements of Africa's past, because it is important. This is the foundation on which we can begin to project ourselves on the world stage. We have to stand on our own grounds. That is the African grounds. That is the African genius, like he put it, to be able to make our contribution on the world stage. And it is critical, I mean, that these institutions exist, like the Institute of African Studies and the Kwabena Nketia Center at AUC-CB. It is prolonging or keeping this legacy alive, and it is important that we continue to give these institutions the support that they need to be able to survive both materially and ideologically, because the ideological warfare, whether we like it or not, is still ongoing, and it's really a very competitive ideological landscape, and to be able to make meaningful contributions within that debate, we have to begin from African ideas and African concepts. And thankfully, institutions like IAS and then the AU BC Kwabena Center are institutions where students and young scholars can come and be introduced to some of these ideas that they can then go on and use that to contribute to the debate that is raging, on the global front. So it is important that we keep these institutions alive because and also materially support them, because then they are really a source for students and for the general public, indeed, also for the general public, because there is a lot of ignorance about Africa's past, within the wider public. And with public lectures and events like these, the public can join in and then, begin to get some knowledge or some understanding about the work that has been done within the African context.
Thank you very much. Question, comment from the audience? Not yet. Okay, some people say third time's a charm, so I will ask a third question. And you're really planting some very important seeds today. I just want to make that observation in terms of the impact of African-centered knowledge. So I want to shift gears a bit and perhaps talk about things that are perhaps more personal to our audience and to the Ghanaian society. You spoke about the colonial legacy of religion and education, particularly Christianity in the Ghanaian context. Could you elaborate upon that colonial legacy and its impact upon our society today?
Yeah. And before I even do that, let me add one more thing to my earlier comment, because I studied chemistry at the University of Ghana, and within the standard chemistry curriculum, you wouldn't find, topics or mentions of Africa's contribution to chemistry. I only got this knowledge when I went to the Institute of African Studies and began to read the works of Sheikh Anta Diop, when he began to talk about chemistry in ancient Egypt. But my standard chemistry textbooks at the Department of Chemistry did not highlight Africa's contributions to chemistry. So I just wanted to chip that in. And concerning religion and the legacy of Christianity, again, I would also urge students to look at the works of Peter K. Sapon, and read his works very carefully and with a very critical eye, because like you said, when the missionaries came here, they really didn't make any attempt to understand our African systems of thought and traditional belief. They were bold enough to declare our gods as lesser gods, and it's a term you still hear today, being brandished around, and they call our forms of worship idol worship and all sorts of names. They came with the preconceived notion of having a superior religion, and we know that is wrong. They didn't spend the time to carefully understand or scrutinize what we were doing as Africans within the realms of religion and spirituality. And it is important because our ancestors, in Africa, survived for a long time before the Europeans arrived, by virtue of creating systems of thought within the spiritual or religious realm that kept us body and soul and psyche together. And today we're beginning to see an unraveling across the board, where people are beginning to question some of the tenets and some of the teachings of Christianity, and after these critical examinations have been done on Christianity, and then they are like, okay, so where do I turn next? Where can I find some psychic anchor, to be able to hold me? And you would find people now beginning to run towards the East. So you find, the resurgence of Buddhism and all kinds of Eastern religions, But then the question is, what about your own African religious systems and spirituality? That is because we have been conditioned, within the Christian realm to look at these practices as quote unquote dark practices. So we cannot turn to them for the creative work or for the instructions that they can give us to be able to have some grounding and some solidity within our spiritual practice. So I would say, again, some work is now being done in revealing some of the, racist attitudes that European missionaries had towards our African religious systems of practice, and with more of such work, we'll begin to, to clean that, that dirt away from it, and then we can now have something polished that, young people are succeeding, or this generation and succeeding subsequent generations can look at and begin to turn to African traditional religion for some ideas that they can use to guide their lives today. So it is really important that we do that work. Otherwise, when we find ourselves in a state of spiritual confusion, the traditional, the spiritual systems of the West and the East cannot save you. To a large extent, yes, these bodies of thought have been developed for the world, but we also developed our own based on our environment and our history. So it is important that we begin to look at some of what we developed as a people, which is very context specific to what we cherished and valued, and that could be the way forward, I would say.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I want to give an opportunity to audience members to engage with our speaker. Anyone, you have a question, comment? You want to do the next one? Okay. So I still have questions. I've learned so much, so that's why I have quite a few questions. You mentioned the role of the writer, which I was very intrigued by. The role of the writer, and I would say the reader, in Ghanaian context. Could you elaborate upon that? Because I think it's a very important issue to discuss in our context.
Yeah. I've always been an avid reader, when I began reading, you would find that I was really, attracted to the great Russian writers, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and then over time, I'll turn my attention to the great English writers, Shakespeare, Milton, and then you go to the French, and all of these novels or creative work were done based on, for example, let me say the Russian soul or the Russian psyche. So when Dostoevsky or Tolstoy is writing, they are writing from the perspective of the Russian soul, if I can use that phrase. Because Nkrumah said that our writers must study the African soul, and by so doing, contribute an African literature, uniquely African literature, to world literature. So we must begin to look at this very carefully. And I would say one writer that has really done a good job in this direction is Ayikoyama. So if you look at the body of work that Ayikoyama has produced, it's a really important contribution, in terms by way of African literature to world literature. Because he started off by examining within the Ghanaian context, political and social situations in the beautiful ones are not yet born. And then he followed that up with other books, and then he went into into ancient Egypt, to get knowledge and produce books like Osiris Rising, and stuff like that. And it's important that we engage with these texts, because then, like Nkrumah said, this is an examination of the African soul, and it's being done by Africans, and it is critical that writers pick up this task, because every now and then we are surrounded by events, that happen around us that uniquely or are quintessentially Ghanaian in nature. And it is up to our writers to highlight these occurrences and these phenomena, So part of it, part of my contribution to this, and that is what was mentioned in my brief bio, is the magazine that I have founded called The God. And The God is a magazine that is quintessentially going to discuss Ghanaian socio-political and cultural issues, from the uniquely Ghanaian lens. So we only welcome articles that writers are pondering on Ghanaian, experiences and phenomena, because then this is partly what I want to bring across, and I want to highlight that we have to write about our own practices, or as Mamdani said, we have to theorize our own realities in very creative ways. And if we don't do that, then you invite, foreigners to come in and begin to write from their perspective, and their perspective, will always be colored by, some form of prejudice, no matter how hard they try, or they cannot really capture it completely and thoroughly like we can if we do the job ourselves. And like Achebe said, we have to tell our own stories. It's the only way to go.
Very good. Thank you very much. Madam, would you like to ask your question? So please, proceed.
Good day, sir. I'm Fidelia.
Thank you. I'm Noble.
So, yeah, my question is, we all do agree, a lot is on the way to trying to achieve this lost part of Africanism. Don't you think we are still to be tackling the angle, that particular angle, to attract these young ones, looking at the dominance of AI in this perspective?
I'm not sure I get a question thoroughly. Can you?
My issue is the AI that is being predominant.
Right.
With the young ones, they're not really ready to practical work. And when it comes to Africanism, it's a lot is done, but they're not getting the right angle in which they can emerge with.
Yeah. Okay.
That's where, because we're talking about going to the library. No, these are not kids that are ready for that.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. We are in the digital age. We are in this era. In the era of the AI, as it is called, and we all know what AI is doing and how students are engaging with AI across the board. And you're right. I mean, and even with the programming of these AI algorithms, there are question marks, because these algorithms are programmed to predominantly highlight, text or material that is produced by American companies or European companies. So again, there will be that bias within these AI systems, when you're trying to access African-centered knowledge. And so, yes, it is critical that we also begin to join this conversation by digitizing and also programming African materials, so that if students cannot go physically to the library, they can access them on their phones. And I think if you go to the J.H. Nketia archives at the University of Ghana, they are doing a good job at digitizing some of these materials. The BAM library, I know, is also digitizing some of the materials. And then, it will then now be the work of, like Nkrumah said, young scholars to now come and use their computing skills and programming skills to make these body of work also available within the AI realm, because if we don't come in to do it or find the importance of including our materials, some white European somewhere studying in Harvard is not interested in doing this kind of work. He may be doing computer science or programming, but he's probably concerned with bringing in Tolstoy's work or, Shakespeare's work or, work produced by Europeans or Americans. Who will bring in the works produced by Ayukuyama? Who would find the importance to do that? We have to do it. So in the field of computer science, so in the computer science departments in the University of Ghana, we must begin to train the students with the conscious effort of, pushing them in the direction of digitizing our materials or working on our materials. Just like Professor Kojo Osuasare did with his engineering students, setting them the task of going to collect proverbs for the purposes of using that to teach engineering. The same way, computer science engineering, computer science, this programming that is being done in African universities must begin to channel the students in the direction. It's the only way, because if we don't do it, they're not going to do it for us. But so if they don't want to physically go to the library, some of us still physically want to go to the library. I like going to the library, but most of them, you're right, don't want to do this, So, but then we have to then find a way of meeting them halfway. So then this will be the task of, computer science students today studying in African universities, So that is what I have to say.
Thank you very much. Additional comment? As opposed to passive learning. Any comments, questions from the audience? I have two additional questions. I think we'll close I think we'll close with that in the interest of time. I'll combine the questions. The first one has to deal with Kwame Nkrumah's conceptualization of African-centered approaches to intellectual productivity in Ghana, Africa, and the world. Could you talk more particularly about Afrocentricity, which arguably has gone the furthest in advancing an African-centered approach to life in the African world community? Your thoughts about the significance of Afrocentricity and its impact inside and outside of the academy, which was certainly influenced by Kwame Nkrumah's articulation of the African-centered approach, according to Professor Malefikete Asante. The second question is related. And I keep moving back to thinking about contemporary society. You mentioned the Library of African Classics that was invoked by Nkrumah during his speech at Legon. What suggestions would you give on operationalizing the goals articulated in the African genius in the contemporary context? How would we operationalize those goals, for instance, of creating a Library of African Classics in the contemporary context? I hope those two questions were clear.
Yeah, they are pretty clear. Yeah, I'll start from the second one. I would say, it's going to be a collective effort, involving scholars, students, the state, entrepreneurs, who are interested in preserving this important African legacy and interested in building institutions that could house the materials that could become the foundation of the Library of African Classics. We have to begin to, demand some of these institutions to be funded, I would say, by the state. And Nkrumah always showed the way. He gave us examples. During his time, some such dreams did not have any budget. You would go to him with ideas concerning some of the things that we're talking about today, and those who were alive at the time will tell you that he will readily sign the check, or he readily make the resources available to build some of these institutions. So I'm pretty confident if were he to be alive for a longer period in Ghana, we would have had the earliest foundations of this Library of African Classics that he referred to, because he showed the way. Personally, I'm studying the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, which was the first, Black learned society in Africa. And again, one of Nkrumah's initiative. He gave money in that direction. The Ghana Science Museum is another of his initiatives. He gave money in that direction. So again, it is really up to our state institutions or our leaders to begin to appreciate the importance of doing this kind of work, and that ties into the first question, because that is the only way we can now have the foundation upon which we can begin to project our African-centered ideas. Because our African-centered ideas have to, rest on ideas and concepts produced within African societies by African scholars, and like I keep saying, it is the only way forward for us as Africans or Black people, because European literature or Eurocentric ideas can only take you so far. Yes, they also open up certain vistas of the imagination, granted, but then again, they always have their limitations, and it is up to us to now bring in the African-centered ways of, looking at the world, for example, within our languages, which provide interesting perspectives on reality, that we can begin to engage with in very creative ways. So yes, other systems of thought and thinking are good, but they all have their limitations. And we, within our own specific context and environment in Africa, must begin to also produce our own, or appreciate what has been done in the past, within various realms. The work of Kobina Nketia in music is really astonishing, how he studied African drum language, African poetry, in the oral tradition, songs, it's really inspiring to engage with this, African way of producing lyrical work, in music and dancing, And this is what we also bring to the table on the banquet of civilization. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Did
I
you
don't know
have?
if that answers your questions or both questions.
Yes, I was going to ask if you had anything particularly to say about Malefikete Asante's approach to Afrocentricity.
Not really. I do agree with him to a large extent. So I really don't have, I don't have any thoughts at this moment, but I do agree with him to a large extent.
Okay. Well, if there are no additional comments and questions, I think we'll end with some closing remarks. Any questions, comments, audience members? Okay. So as we conclude this session of the Kobina Nketia Center for Africana Studies Global African Diaspora Lecture Series, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to our speaker and participants in this insightful, in their insightful contributions. Today's discussion has deepened our understanding of continental Africa and the African diaspora's impact and significance. I urge us to carry forward the knowledge and inspiration gained here, fostering continued dialogue and collaboration. Let us carry forward this legacy. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Until we meet again, keep the conversation alive. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.